Loud and clear.
From the studios of Radio Sputnik in downtown Washington, D.C., it's Loud and Clear. We take you inside the news 5 days a week. It's happening, and it's happening now. I'm Brian Becker. The U.S. intelligence agency's unclassified report on Russia's alleged involvement in the election didn't provide any evidence of hacking, instead choosing to focus on media such as RT, including a show that hasn't been on the air since 2014. We'll speak to Abby Martin about why her show, Breaking the Set, was included in the report and the way the mainstream media misreported her leaving the station RT. President Obama gives his farewell speech tonight in Chicago just 10 days before the end of his administration. What is the real legacy of Barack Obama? Today marks 10 years since George W. Bush ordered a troop surge in Iraq at the height of the U.S. occupation. But a decade later, thousands of U.S. forces remain as the Iraqi army advances on Mosul. We'll take a look back on the U.S. role in Iraq and its role going forward. But first we turn to the U.S. intelligence report on Russia and their campaign against RT. We are joined by Abby Martin, currently the host of the Empire Files on TeleSUR. She was previously the host of RT's program, Breaking the Set, that is mentioned in the unclassified intelligence report on Russia's alleged election meddling. Welcome, Abby Martin.
Thanks so much for having me on, Brian.
Thank you for joining. Wow, it's been a rough ride for the past few days. You have the intelligence report saying that Russia impacted the elections, that they meddled in the elections, that it came from the highest levels of the Russian government. And the intelligence report also says, this is from the Director of National Intelligence, that your show, Breaking the Set, was fundamental to the Russian effort to impact on the election. I mean, when you saw that, how did you feel?
I was quite taken aback, Brian. First of all, I didn't know I had that much power. I didn't know that reporting from, 5 years ago had wielded the American electorate to, the 20,000 votes in Wisconsin. I didn't realize that many people were watching my show on RT from not long ago. And it really sowed the seeds to overturn the election results. I mean, the whole thing is so unbelievably, audaciously ridiculous. I can't even muster the words to talk about how insane this is the evidence that they have. I mean, it should be laughed off instead of taken seriously by these establishment publications. And instead you have the New York Times and Washington Post hailing it as if it's some sort of damning, serious report that we should be taking seriously. It is a joke.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. This is what the report says for our audience. In the run-up to the 2012 U.S. presidential election in November, English language channel RT America, created and financed by the Russian government and part of Russian government-sponsored RT TV, intensified its usually critical coverage of the United States. The channel portrayed the United States electoral process as undemocratic and featured calls by U.S. protesters for the public to rise up and take this government back. That's in quotes. RT introduced two new shows, Breaking the Set on September 4th and Truth Seeker on November 2nd, both overwhelmingly focused on criticism of the U.S. and Western governments, as well as the promotion of radical discontent. I mean, how is that espionage? I mean, this was 4 years ago. That's what they're talking about. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And the radical discontent, what does that mean? As the report says, which, by the way, a third of it is bashing RT, an annex from 2012. But let's go over what they call out RT for. Third-party coverage, right? Fracking, Occupy Wall Street, and they even say alleged Wall Street greed. These are fundamental core issues that Americans need to hear about, should care about. They impact them and their communities. What this report really says to me, Brian, is that these issues are the most threatening thing to the U.S. establishment, that talking about environmentalism, talking about climate change, talking about Wall Street, these are things people care about across party lines. And it even contradicts themselves multiple times throughout the report. First, they're saying RT has so much power that it swung the election. Meanwhile, they're saying not enough people watch it to even make a dent, right? And they're also saying, okay, my show fomented this radical discontent. Meanwhile, it's saying that I called out the two-party system for being a sham. Well, which is it? Did we say vote for Trump? Did we say, here, pay attention to third parties? It is unbelievable, just the contradictions in this small report that is based on completely insane, unfounded rhetoric.
And Abby Martin, you became also a feature in a very important, prominently displayed article in the New York Times. It's the most important newspaper in the United States, at least, that's the way it's understood to be in the country. I woke up, read the New York Times, and there you were again. And the New York Times article was so amazing because it was completely false when it came to its presentation, its report about you and how you ended up leaving RT. I want to read again for the audience because the article has now gone through multiple iterations as the New York Times tries to clean up its act, and you've officially responded. But the article says Russia's RT, this is the headline, Russia's RT, the network implicated in U.S. election meddling. And this was, again, on Sunday, on January 8th. It reads, 2 anchors who quit during live broadcasts say the network is a propaganda outlet, and then went on to say, Abby Martin, that's you, who said before quitting what Russia did was wrong. That was about Crimea. Talk us through what the article was talking about and how they got it wrong.
Absolutely. So the New York Times is kind of, it's promoted as the premier publication to set the narrative for the Beltway, right? The Washington Post and the New York Times, the so-called papers of record. Unfortunately, what they really are is the premier publication setting false narratives and have time and again selling war, selling propaganda on behalf of the state, which worries me much more than, let's say, Russia Today. Okay, so New York Times, you can go from the Iraq War, the Sony hack, bringing us up to date. Yes, not only did they vociferously defend the absurd intelligence report that's comical by saying that it was serious and damning, but then the next day, like you said, they published this absurd story saying that I quit on air, denounced the station as propaganda, used me alongside with Liz Wall as their, these 2 main examples of people who denounced the Putin propaganda of the network. What the reality is, Brian, and this is amazing, and it really shows you how the author Russell Goldman really was grasping so hard to maintain this narrative that even after I called him out and he issued a correction, it was still completely misleading and obfuscating of what the truth was, because what the truth is completely contradicts his point, and I'll walk you through that right now. So I realized that it said not only did I quit on air, it said again, what Russia did is wrong, and insinuate that I walked off set and ended my job there because of Ukraine. So what really happened is that I spoke to management about my concerns. I voiced those concerns on air. And not only did I keep my job, unlike Phil Donahue, Cenk Uygur, many other people in the corporate press who dare to criticize what the U.S. establishment is doing, I was able to keep my primetime show on the network for the next year. I was able to voice criticisms from the MH17 plane to several instances of the Ukraine situation, to Syria, to other instances of Putin and Russia, able to keep my job, able to keep that primetime spot. So after I called out Russell Goldman from the New York Times, which, by the way, the article had been up for almost an entire day with these egregious errors about me. So who knows how many tens of thousands of people already read these falsehoods and believe them. And no one looks at the correction at the bottom of the page anyway, even if it were accurate. So after I told Russell Goldman, please correct this, I did not quit on air, and I did not ever denounce the station as propaganda, the correction he made was insane. He wrote a correction at the bottom saying, Abby quit some months after denouncing the Ukraine incursion. And really what that shows, Brian, is that they were so desperate that they wanted to make it seem like I still quit over political differences about the Crimea thing, when that couldn't be further from the truth. And it just totally obfuscates what the truth really was. And in fact, like I said, it shows that this isn't a Kremlin mouthpiece. You can't totally castigate this network in this cartoonish totalitarian way, when the truth is I was able to denounce Putin, keep my show for a year. And how many anchors on the corporate press can say that about their financiers?
Indeed. And then I was following the corrections because the author and the editors, obviously, because this was a big deal for the New York Times, this article, which was obviously false about you and presenting you're leaving RT in a false way. And then as you challenged them and demanded a correction, the correction was then really false because it gave the impression that you still were, as you said, quitting because of your differences over Ukraine, or that you were forced out because of Ukraine. But then it would have occurred to people as they read the article, well, this would have meant that Abby Martin was able to continue in her primetime show, Breaking the Set, for months after on air criticizing a policy of the Russian government, which would mean that RT really wasn't this straight out, tightly run propaganda operation. So social media people started hitting the New York Times, and then they had a new iteration of the article, which dropped any mention of you, like you dropped out of the article for about an hour. And then there was another iteration which went back to another inept or false or inadequate correction. I mean, this shows the New York Times was jumping through hoops. And I would tell our audience, if the New York Times can't get these facts right, these facts are not hard to understand. These facts are not hard to come by. If they can't get these facts right, we'd have to challenge the factual presentation, because when the New York Times speaks, people say that must be true.
Exactly. I mean, these facts were readily available on Wikipedia, for goodness sake. I mean, this is basic fact-checking. Basic fact-checking. I mean, if RT published an article that contained such glaring inconsistencies, it would be called out. The person would probably be fired because of so much heat and eyes are on this network. They have to be super on top of it and accurate. So when someone like the New York Times does this so carelessly and is editing real time, I mean, like you said, there were so many iterations. And as we know, Brian, you have to actually mark. That is standard. Every single edit that is made in a publication like this, you are supposed to clarify the edit down below in the correction. And any modification that's made needs to be marked for the readership. And that was not done. And like you said, a paragraph was missing, then it was put back in, then another sentence was removed. I mean, it was a complete mess and a complete joke. But hey, that's standard for a publication that promotes false narratives and desperately tries to shill for the establishment time and again. It's embarrassing. And really, you know, it's just so amazing when you look at the total role reversal. You know, you have this bipartisanship where back in 2003, it was the Democrats demanding evidence, you know, for the Iraq War. And today it's the Republicans demanding evidence for this. But the New York Times, in both instances, has shilled hard for that narrative, no matter what.
I can remember during the Vietnam War as a teenager when I was protesting against the Vietnam War, people in the media would say to me or challenge me when I was disagreeing with U.S. policy in Vietnam. They would say, "Why don't you go back to Russia?" In other words, this has now become part of the DNA of American politics, this kind of witch hunting. If you disagree with American policy, if you, for instance, as you did so well on Breaking the Set, bring the news that the mainstream media wasn't covering, say, about the Occupy movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, then it's like, go back to Russia, Abby, or you are a mouthpiece of Russia, because that really is what the criticism insinuates. By virtue of criticizing the U.S. government policy, you are somehow acting as a traitor or as an agent of a foreign power. I mean, it's really something that doesn't get just sort of immediately blown out of the water, given the history of witch hunting in this country, which supposedly is something from the past. It
is the same story every couple of years. I don't even want to say every generation, because we've seen this time and again, just, iterations over the last decade, whether it be Daniel Ellsberg, whether it be the Church Committee. Everyone is accused of being a Kremlin stooge. You know, it doesn't matter if Russia's not communist at all. You'll still see that communist iconography, this totalitarian kind of monarchy. And yeah, I mean, let's be honest. It is completely not about this at all. The real threat to the U.S. empire is usurping its supremacy in the Middle East. And the second that Russia did not go along with the Iraq War, we shifted our policy right then and there. And from then on, Russia was the enemy. And Russia and China are about to be confronted a lot more in the coming years, because we know that the U.S. empire doesn't play fair and doesn't play well with partners, even though it should be absolutely coordinating and collaborating with these state actors to actually address the real grave threats in the world. But we know that there is no real logic when it comes to global domination and imperialism, Brian.
I agree with you completely. Abby, I want to go back to the role of the media, because the mainstream media in the United States, because they say, well, Russia's media or RT is highly politicized. But as you're making the point, and I know directly, personally, the U.S. mainstream media could not be more politicized and could not sound more like an echo chamber for the United States. When you spoke out on RT on air about Crimea, you received a series of invitations right then and there from the mainstream media to come on their news outlets to talk about your stance. I can remember that very vividly because it seemed to me that they were entirely expecting you as a person, because you had a disagreement with your employer, which happened to be RT, that you would somehow come on air and denounce RT, denounce Russia, denounce the entire operation, and as a consequence, they were ready to treat you like a hero because you had done something that they, fit into their political agenda. Talk about what actually happened and what happened when you received those invitations from mainstream media.
Brian, I was a hero for a day. It was fascinating. Being a media critic for years, of course, before that, I was astutely aware of the role that I was playing. I was being used as a pawn from a lot of different sides there. A hero for a day, bolstered up on the entire international stage, treated as a hero, right? This woman speaks out, denounces Putin propaganda on their own station. What they didn't realize was who I really was. I was a loose cannon and I couldn't be controlled or used. So I went on Piers Morgan, and I basically just told him that CNN should be ashamed of themselves. Not only do they self-censor all the time, which he laughed at, but I also just said, what are you guys doing? You're fear-mongering and war-mongering against a nuclear state. I mean, this is outrageous, So I was never asked on again. It was a very short segment, but I was also on NPR, which I had to call them out and remind their reporter that they're funded by oil corporations, and they've lied several times when it comes to the BP oil spill. They printed several propaganda stories to promote a false narrative on that. So every media outlet has corporate constraints. When you see the Washington Post and New York Times promoting this fake news narrative, and really they just paint all non-corporate media with this broad brush of being fake news. It's outrageous. It's slanderous. And this whole attack on RT, and that's what it is. Let's be clear. This is a clear attack to undermine and potentially, in the future, shut down Russian state media in this country. And that is an insanely slippery slope. We have to completely, vocally protest and contest all of these attacks because, like I said, if it starts here, where does it end, Brian? We need to stand up and fight this.
That's Abby Martin. I have to say, Abby, in conclusion, I was extremely impressed by the way you handled yourself, because obviously if you had said what CNN wanted you to say or what NPR said what they wanted you to say, in other words, saying what they wanted you to say instead of what you wanted to say as a strong principled person, they would have rolled out the red carpet for you. But you stood up. You stood up for what you believe in. You told the truth. You did it in an unwavering way. I was extremely impressed by what you did back then, and extremely unimpressed by the intelligence report and by the New York Times and the mainstream media. We're out of time. Abby Martin, she's with TeleSUR, The Empire Files. Be sure to check it out. You are listening to Loud and Clear. We'll be back.